Hey everyone, welcome to the Compliance Corners. Today I'm really happy to be back with Lee, and we're going to be talking about how to build compliance and security organizations, whether or not you've inherited one or you're building one from scratch. I think it's really an interesting space to talk about when we look at like what are the things that make it successful. So again, I'm Milan, and I've dealing with compliance and engineering for quite a long time. And today in this series with Lee, we talk about things that kind of cross security and compliance. So without further ado, let me bring Lee back. Hey Lee, how are you doing?
Hey, I'm good.
It's good, great. So let's take care of a little bit of housekeeping. At first, I put the disclaimer: this is our views, not necessarily our corporate views. So that's really important to kind of get out there. And also, like if you have questions, we really like to take questions. So we're hoping to keep this somewhat interactive. So please do put Q colon in your questions in chat, and we'll be able to answer. If we don't get to them immediately due to the lag, we will definitely get to them all before the end of the stream. So again, thanks everyone for that. And we are going to go ahead and kick in. So this again is a continuation of the topic that we talked about in the blog, which the link is down below in the description as well, where we talk about in the blog, but now we want to go into a bit more detail on these topics and then be able to also take some Q&A from the audience. So with that, let me go ahead and just switch the topic here. And okay, so today, again, we're talking about the primary factors, considerations, and challenges that security and compliance leaders must consider to build successful organizations. So, Lee, I think what we want to do is let's kick off with just going right into the first topic, which is how do you build a team from scratch? So, from a security perspective, why don't you give us some of your thoughts about when you build a security organization from scratch? What do you think about?
Yeah, I think if you're fortunate enough that you can walk into a greenfield environment, that's awesome, right? Because you kind of have a blank slate. But the nice thing about the cybersecurity or information security space is that there's a lot of frameworks out there that you can draw from. My personal favorites are like CIS and NIST, and I'd say if you're a leader walking in, let's say that you're at a startup or even a large company, right, that just hasn't for some reason built a comprehensive security program, you walk in, pick your favorite framework. If there's one that aligns to the industry you're in, great. If not, pick one of the general ones and just start there. Do some sort of baseline assessment of like, hey, where are we today, if anywhere, right? I think a lot of times, a leader, even if they're coming in and they have a greenfield environment, they'll find that like, oh, this group is spending a little bit of money doing this over here, and this group is spending a little bit of money doing this over here, but no one's actually coordinating those type of things. So I think once you get your framework that you've picked, you've kind of done your baseline assessment of like, where are we, if anywhere? And then you can kind of go through and build your strategy and say, all right, based on this framework, these are the top 3 risks that we want to start addressing first. We're going to invest in a SIM or an incident response team, or pick your favorite control and go from there. And that will inform your strategy and your plan going forward that you eventually go.
Uh-oh, Lee, did you lock up? Technical difficulty? Uh-oh, I think Lee's locked up. Let me see. He might need to rejoin. Hang on. Lee, can you hear me? No? All right, I pinged him. Let's see. All right, let me see what I can do here. Let me knock Lee out and see if he can come back. So, okay, so technical difficulties, we all have to deal with them. So, what we'll do is I will talk a little bit while he was talking about what it means. Let's see, is he back now? He was trying. All right, so I'm going to talk a little bit from the compliance perspective. What I would say is I do agree that you have to figure out your baseline of expectations. I do think that's extremely important because if you don't have that, it becomes really difficult to build out what you want your program to be. I think I would take it one step further is when you talk about the basic requirements that Lee was talking about, which is really around the you have a NIST framework or a basic framework, I think you also want to look at your business cases from scratch. So what I mean by that is you really also want to be able to, hang on, I'm trying to copy this in here so he can maybe join back up. Okay. So you really want to go through and then think about what are those business areas that you want to go into. And I think there are some basic ones. I think most people would agree that a SOC 2 is probably a requirement for any service. But then are you in a financial service base? Do you need to have SOC 1 type 2? Are you wanting to use credit cards and those type of items? Because if you do, then you might need other frameworks like PCI or healthcare. You're going to need HIPAA. So you really also want to understand your product with your product owners to really kind of align the expectations between what it means of what you have to go build out from scratch, and also like then that will factor into the funding. Because I think one of the things that a lot of compliance teams, we'll talk about this more when you inherit a compliance team or you move to one, is what are the actual overall success metrics? Because I think at times, we look at compliance as a set of controls, but in reality, it's also a big part of the business. And what I mean by a big part of the business is that you have to understand the costs and what it means to be successful. I've seen a number of times when they're starting out a compliance area is you don't think about what it means to prep for it. So to me, a big part of the prep comes around understanding if you have a framework, do you already kind of know how you're going to fit into that framework and either pass it or not? Because we all know in the compliance space, if you go into an audit blind, which is, hey, I have to go ahead and, I have this framework and I'm going to start auditing it. I get the controls, I get the list from the auditors, but you don't really have a sense of what you're walking into. So to me, when you build up a compliance program and team, you really want to think about how do you bring things on successfully. So again, I did another topic about metrics, but the metrics are important because if they don't align to the engineering or product metrics, then how can you adequately cost it out and then ensure that the success will also map? So what I would say to that is really think about what those metrics look like and then whether or not you can actually make sure that they're going to align, because if they don't align, it becomes really challenging to actually go in and then really see, is it going to map to my business requirements? So again, retrofitting is harder, and we'll talk about retrofitting in bringing on new work. But if you go into a program and you create it from scratch, you don't do enough planning work up front for what the baseline set of controls are, which is what Lee was alluding to, by picking a good framework that covers them broadly. But then you also have to cover the things like accessibility and privacy. And there's a min bar of requirements that you need to factor in, as well as build upon the frameworks that you'll want to have in order to be successful. So what I would say is really take a hard look at that. And when you think about what success really looks like and means, then think about like, what do you want to build and how do you have to skill that up from the beginning? Because again, you may not have all the skills. And as Lee says, and I agree with that, you want to be able to factor that through as you kind of go through the overall requirements of building a team out from the beginning. So I think that that's really important as you continue to play out and build out your program. What does it really mean to start from scratch and then build in the right skill set in order to move through it? So with that, what we'll also now do is we'll kind of move on to inheriting. Inheriting a compliance team in particular, I would say is I would still go back and think about understanding certain key aspects of the organization that you inherited. And for me, a big part of that is the metrics. So the metrics, clearly you have to understand how the team was measuring success. Does that align with the other organizational metrics, engineering metrics, business metrics? And the metrics part of it can be kind of challenging because general compliance teams, as we talked about in the previous session, really sometimes don't align to the same type of metrics that will drive a certain behavior. So making sure you really understand like how the metrics were set up that they're tracking today, what the goals of them are, what value those provide to the business is really critical. Because again, just completing audits or collecting a bunch of pieces of evidence won't necessarily map to how the engineering team or even the product team looks at the success of a program. So while the metrics are always important, they'll always be at the top of mind. There's another couple of soft areas that you really want to dig into when you're taking over an organization like that. The other factor that you want to think about is really around what the overall culture is that the compliance organization is in the middle of. So what I mean by that is, I've talked about, like, there are three different things that leaders look at. Are you making money, saving money, or costing money? So understanding how your team is perceived in the grander scheme of the business, culture wise, is extremely important, because if you don't have a lot of trust and credibility as a team in not just being seen as an overhead function, it's going to be much more difficult to drive the things that you really need to have in order to be successful. Now, again, this is going to be different in every organization you go into, but in general, compliance is usually seen as an overhead function, right? It costs a lot of money. It takes my engineers away from things that they should be doing, which is writing new features. And I'm at least see if we can get Lee to join back in here. Oh, and it looks like Lee is back, so I'm going to switch him back. All right, welcome back, Lee. Technical, hey, we
Sorry,
roll
they're
with
working on
technical
the
issues.
yeah. So they're working on the internet in my neighborhood, and apparently that was like the perfect timing mid sentence to like take everything down. So we'll see if it stays up again. So apologies
Okay, well,
for.
we'll roll with it if it happens. Hey, we roll with technical punches. That's what compliance and security
Hey,
does, right? We
the
get
first
punches
one
and we
went
roll
so
with it.
well. The first one went so well, right? We got to obviously have some hiccups on the
Yeah,
second
that's
one.
okay. We now we have to check our internet, utilities now. But Lee, I went through some of the compliance, startups, but I went ahead and moved on a little bit here to the what happens when you inherit an organization. So what I was just kind of talking about is I talked about the metrics and how metrics need to align to the overall product and business metrics, and that we talked about that, and I've talked about that in previous episodes. But the other thing I was talking about was culture. And it's really important when you inherit a team to understand how your team is perceived in that culture. Are you seen as an overhead function? Is it antagonistic? Is it hostile? And I think that's really important to know, like, what you're walking into, because behavior changes based on attitudes. And if the attitude is poor and there's a lot of friction, then that has to be one of the things, at least from a compliance perspective, you have to address. Because if you're not seen as a valued partner that's adding value, then it just becomes really antagonistic and it makes it really hard to do anything. So when you talked about the metrics, I kind of talked about culture. And then the other thing that I would want to just mention from my side is, when you inherit an organization, is understanding and identifying the key leaders, particularly engineering leaders, that you're going to have to go drive work with and start building a positive relationship. So it's not just about the team culture, it's about individual culture relationships and understanding what their needs are and how you can help meet those needs. So again, those from a high level is kind of what I look at. And Lee, I'd love to hear what you look at from a security perspective.
No. I mean, I totally agree. And so I think the challenge when you inherit a program, right, is there's organizational momentum, right, that has been obviously built up by your predecessor, and or cultural differences, for example, that might arise, right? And so, as you said, it's not going to be overly successful if your predecessor, was in there and just telling everyone no, and or was very restrictive on what they were doing. That's not going to work out well, right? So I think whether you're building a new program or whether you're inheriting a program, really, I think the first thing I would do if I was inheriting one would be exactly what you said. Who are my peers? Right. So are they in the engineering organization? Is it other C-suite? Is it the board? Like who are my peers that I'm actually having to have be stakeholders and influence for these decisions that I need support from? Right. And so let's just say that it's the CTO. Okay, great. Mr. or Mrs. CTO, what are the things that are your top challenges? Here are the things that I'm seeing based on the baseline that I've done. Like, where can we align, right? Because the reality is, whether you're a compliance program or you're a security program, you probably don't own, right, a lot of those things. You're asking to go do that work, right? So, Milan, I've talked about this. It's like getting the engineering teams to actually go do something, right? There has to be justification for that. So if you're going to be asking, another organization for support or resources or funding or technology or whatever, you need to spend a lot of time with those leaders and build up that credibility, build up that alliances to help support you. Because you might be going in there and saying, okay, I've inherited this program. My predecessor did these three things. Guess what? I actually think that the top risks are different, right? Based on my assessment, we need to go pivot for this. We now need to ask for a new budget or new, controls or new whatever. So therefore I need your support to go do those things. Right. And so I definitely think, it's more challenging when you've inherited, because you have to then work on changing that organizational momentum, changing that culture, using your leadership skills to really try to change the mindset and convince people that what was happening before may not be the thing that's going to happen in the future. And that takes time, right? And that's honestly, a lot of the job of the, security executive or compliance executive going forward is you're spending a lot of time convincing people that you need to do something differently.
No, that's great. So let's stop there for a second, because I'm really curious. As a security leader, how do you go about that? Like, what are some of the specific things you do, like when you take over a new organization, to go build that confidence and leadership from the security standpoint, right? Because again, we all know that has to happen, but I'd be curious, as a security leader, when you talked about, building that trust as a security leader, what exactly do you do? Can you give some examples of that?
Yeah, sure. So, I think, the nice thing about when you start at a new organization is you can kind of play the new person card for a while, right? So like, hey, I'm new here. How does this work? Right. And like, show me your asset inventory, or show me how your SIM works, or show me how you pass out. And then I do think that, falling back on, your strategic plan or your compliance framework or your security framework or whatever, where you say, hey, I'm just trying to get a baseline. Like, how does this work? What do you think? This is how I'm approaching it. And you really just kind of need to get that mind share there. And honestly, a lot of it is asking questions and then listening, right? You're asking the questions to hear what they are saying, and you're going to get a lot of feedback through that, as opposed to trying to go through and just start coming in hot and be like, okay, this is how we're going to do stuff. And it's like, whoa, whoa, whoa. Right. You haven't gotten that philosophical alignment yet. So I find, when I came into my current role, I spent probably the better part of the first year that I was there just asking a lot of questions, understanding what was there, trying to figure out how things worked, who are the key players that I need to talk to influence things, like how does the culture work, what are the processes you have to understand. And then once you kind of have that understanding of, okay, this is the lay of the land, now you can say, okay, I don't think this process is working as should, or I don't think we're invested enough in this area, or this person has viewed us as an antagonistic relationship. How do I change that, right? What do I need to do to change that perception? Oh, I need to go invest in this area and convince them that I'm doing the things that they want me to do, even though it might not be the top priorities for me based on the risk plan that I have, right? So there's a lot of like balancing act to go there, but I would honestly say like the biggest thing to start is like just building those alliances, building those relationships, asking those questions. Just ask the stupid questions, right? I mean, what does it matter? That's your job, Don't be afraid to just get in there and be like, how does this work, right? And that's going to help you out, I think, in the long term.
Yeah, I agree with you. I'll actually take it one step further. You kind of hit upon it a little bit about trying to figure out like what a pain point might be with them. I actually go in very similar to you. Is I'll just say, hey, I'll say, what are your three biggest things you hate about dealing with compliance? Like, you
Right.
just tell me what they are. I may not agree with them. Like, again, that's a perception, and perception's 9/10 reality. So if I can get out of them what their biggest pain points of dealing with the compliance program is, whether or not I agree that it's right or wrong, at least I can then address that mindset, right? Because again, they have a mindset and it's a challenge, and they usually fall within certain themes when it comes from compliance. We've talked about some of those, right? Coming in a day late and a dollar short with a bad request that we then need to revisit 3 or 4 times. I think I've heard that in just about every team I've ever worked with in terms of compliance. But again, they may have a different set. So the two things I do is, one, I try to figure out and get them to really be transparent to the core, as hard as it may be to hear, why don't you like compliance? Because then at least I have something I can go try to address. So I think that's been a very valuable tool for me personally. And then the other one is I'll offer work for free. I kind of had this say like first hits for free. So I try to build that credit by asking them, is there anything I can help you with? Because you know how it is, right? The compliance team shows up always asking for something. I need this, I need that. But how often do you actually get to provide value back to them, to actually say, hey, like they did something for me? Because it goes back to human nature. If you're always there asking them for something and not providing them something valuable, do they really want to help you over time? You're seen as nothing but a tax. So I think for
Right.
me, it really becomes important to build up those positive credits. as early as possible to show them that we're actually there to help. Because in general, I know we all look at compliance as the micro or dirty job of engineering, particularly engineers do, because I was one for many years. But you can actually show them value if you understand what their biggest pain points are or where it's most efficient and help them with that. So I think that's really great, to kind of look at like both sides of that coin. And remember, everything we're talking about now is relationship and trust building and confidence building. We haven't actually talked about specific compliance things, because if you don't have that trust, then you're never going to get to the actual items, because it's always just going to be seen as an overhead function. So I think that's great, Lee. Anything else that comes up for you when it comes to inheriting a program?
Yeah, I'd say, look, whether you're inheriting a program or you're starting a new one, the biggest thing that I found on top of everything that you mentioned is credibility, right? So to your point, you go in and say, what are your pain points? Oh, I hate security. All they do is tell me no. Okay, that's fine, right? And then let's say you come to that team and say, well, I'm going to fix that, right? I'm going to change this process so that you enjoy working with us, or that it's easier for you, or blah, whatever you tell them, right? You have to deliver on that, right? Because if you make the commitment or the promise, and you've listened, you've heard them, you've acknowledged their pain points, and then you don't do anything about it,
That's
now
right.
you've just gone back to what the situation they were in before, right? So I found that the biggest thing is like, look, throughout this whole process of asking people questions and trying to raise their top pain points, it's going to be contentious, right? Because obviously there was a situation that developed over time that resulted in you inheriting that program, right? And that's okay, right? But now you have to actually go through and say, great, here's the plan, or here's the issues that I agree with you with or don't agree with. This is what we're going to do, and we actually have to go do those things. And if you don't, not going to work out
That's
too well,
right.
right? So I think credibility and just being like true to your word. If you say you're going to do something, go do it. And then I think, that trust will build. And then next thing you know, to your point, instead of you always coming to them for an ask, they might come to you for an ask, right? And now the relationship has changed, and it's a more of a two-way street, as opposed to, bias towards one group or the other group. And that's
No,
been one
no,
of the biggest things I've noticed.
no. That's great. And I have a great question here from TZP. So I'll hold this up here. So the question for those, if you're listening to the replay on audio only, is how to convince other functions engineering to do more work for compliance when they're already busy with their day job, when you spot a risk with the status quo. This is a very complex question, but I'll try to address it in as simplistic manner as possible. Which for me, and then Lee, would love to hear it from your perspective from a security. It's the same thing. Is it really comes down to what the impact of that's going to be in a way that resonates with that team. And I do another session about metrics, and that one goes into detail on this question. But at a high level, you have to be able to speak in the priority language that the team is using. And talking about risk, which is a lot that compliance talks about, like this is a risky issue, we need to go fix it, doesn't really resonate with a line engineer or even maybe a line manager that's having to balance this work against all the engineering requirements that they get rated on day in and day out. So it's really has to hit this mode of prioritization that's at least seen as equal of what's on their plate today. So at a very high level, a couple of the metrics that I know I go look at, I asked my team to go look at, is how does this impact the customer if we don't go fix it? Because you can't say it's $1 billion risk, because it doesn't hold any weight with some line engineer or line manager. While it may be true at the corporate level, there's the opportunity of that happening, and what's the likelihood of that happening? It's not going to be very high, and all this other kind. So it doesn't resonate. So what I try to do is to go measure that against a risk that they would prioritize. For example, if there is an issue you need them to go fix, how does that relate to the customer? And I talked about this before. Do you have to take the servers down to roll out the patch? Will it have downtime if you hit it in production? Well, if it's like a vuln scan that you shouldn't have at the end of a quarterly PCI audit, are you going to have to take the servers down to patch this when they could have just done it in the quarterly updates or the monthly updates? You have to drive the priority in a way that's going to provide them impact. Because I tell you, no leader, when I tell the leaders, say, look, if you don't go fix this, and when the servers go down and we have to take them down, you're going to have to answer to what I call the big cheese upstairs about why you didn't fix this thing when you knew you had to go do it. Now the onus is on that leader to make that risk call. And in more cases than not, they're not prepared when they understand what the implications to their day job, which customer SLA is usually a part of. Do they want to be the cause of that? Because that is something that the senior leader will understand and know. you can't use it in every case, but you do have to translate that out into the amount of work that's going to impact that engineer directly. So, or that engineering team directly. So that's how I would go through and kind of help reprioritize it in their list. Because as we've talked about before, most engineering teams are 100% booked with non-compliance things. So whatever you're bringing up, if it's an outlier, then you have to make sure it's going to be looked at the same way so it can be prioritized accordingly, or the risk is accepted equally, knowing what that is. So we've had a lot of success in being able to drive those priorities by reframing, but the impact is that's more aligns with something that they care about versus a general risk item. And Lee, I'd love to hear how you deal with it for security issues.
Am I dropped or not? Okay, I think I'm still
Nope,
here.
you're here.
We'll see. Okay, I just got a weird notification that it might have dropped again. So I agree with you. I think where I've found some success that, so let's just take a step back a little bit. I think the issue that is coming up here is that the security teams or the engineering teams are 100% booked, and I think that is the root of this issue, right? And I would actually say that that's a cultural issue, right? That has come up because, sure, engineering teams should be working on code, right? They should be putting products out the door, but that's not, I would argue, 100% true all of the time. So let me give you an example. Engineering team A, right, they have to build a database, right, to support their product, right, blah, blah, blah. And for some reason, they can't use, I don't know, some sort of cloud service that may or may not be available, right? So they built this thing themselves. Great. Now they have to maintain that thing. But if you stack their engineering time 100% full of just product and feature development, who's actually maintaining, right, the underlying infrastructure or the things that product is running on that they are now responsible for because they built it, right? And so where I think the fallacy comes in here to this question is that if the culture is set that it's like the engineering team is only measured performance metrics on features they get out the door, then that's causing an issue culturally for the rest of the things, not just security and compliance, right? Finance might need something, HR might need something, right? Whoever other than engineering might need something from that team. And they're like, sorry, like we're full on feature development. And this is where the contention comes in. And what I've seen from this is a cultural issue from the top, where it's like, to your point, that big cheese at the top needs to be like, hey guys or girls or team, we're expecting you to allocate 20% of your time or whatever the metric is to doing things that may or may not be feature development work, to handle compliance, to handle security, to do your patching, to update your tags in the inventory, to respond to finance requests or whatever it's going to be. And that gives them the flexibility to say, okay, out of this 2-week sprint, I'm going to leave both Fridays open to be able to handle these extra requests. And then to your point, now you have to go to that team that now that they've made the allocation of the time, you have to go to that team and say, what's the priority here? And I do find a lot of times it's not that they don't want to prioritize it, it's that they don't understand it, right? And so like you've gone to them and said, I need you to do this, encrypt this data at rest for PCI. And they're like, cool. Like, I don't know what that means, right? And so now you spend time with them and you say, okay, well, here's what happens. If we send credit cards, right, over the wire, unencrypted or store them unencrypted, we're now non-compliant with this and we're going to lose our credibility with this and we can't operate in this market. We're going to lose, this is how many contracts or customers are tied to this thing. This is why this is bad, right? Okay, now they have context for how they can prioritize that and put that in their next sprint or their next feature development, quarterly rollout, whatever cycle you're on to do that thing. So I think this is to your point, this is a very complex question, nuanced in like a single phrase, but I found that it's both cultural as well as like educational, as well as like priority to actually convince that team it's like, now is the time, right, to go do this thing. Otherwise, these are the outcomes or ramifications. And then you nailed it at the end, which is like, look, ultimately, security, compliance, whoever, we can make the recommendation, right? But the business risk sits with that person that owns those systems or owns that code or owns that product and application. And so if they're like, nah, I don't see it, I'm happy to go talk to the big cheese and tell them that, you're a moron, blah, blah, blah. Okay, let's go have that conversation. And to your point, I found 9 times out of the 10, when you go stand in front of the judge, it's like, just kidding, I'm going to go do that thing, right? So I do think having that sort of removed, manager of like, do you really want to be the guy or girl on record saying you're not going to do that? Usually kind of calms them down a little bit. But at the end of the day, as you know, they can tell us no, fine. We are on record as our jobs of saying that was a bad idea. and the business can choose not to. That's fine. That's totally fine.
Yeah, and this goes back to when I talked about building that trust and credibility with metrics that they understand, because I find that, as you said, it's an understanding issue. And a lot of times I've seen compliance and engineering talking apples and oranges in this space. So how can you have metrics on something you don't understand? And I'll just go out on a limb and say, look, I have to tell you, in most cases, the engineers don't have a lot of incentive to understand our side of it. They don't get rated on it directly. They're not experts in it. It's not seen as the shiny work. So I do believe, and I've always taken the stance, as it's incumbent
This
upon
is a
us
topic.
in
This is
compliance
a topic
to,
I'm very, very passionate about. That I think, and maybe this is a topic for another day, but I think like look, if I was going to start my own company and become Jeff Bezos, right, I would have it as a metric, right, across
that's
all
right.
of the companies that those teams should be measured performance wise against not just their own team, but security, compliance,
No,
HR,
no,
whatever.
I totally agree with you. And
Yeah.
you're starting to see some of that mature. So I absolutely agree with you. I'm just
Yep.
talking about the 30 to 35 years of history of ingrained
Oh yeah.
behavior that we deal with, right? So again, we're talking about real on the street today. And today in the industry, I have calls almost weekly now with companies, compliance teams where they're struggling. I just had one a week ago where their CEO told their chief compliance person, you got to work better with engineering. Right, the compliance team has to work better with engineering. Well, but if you think about this, and Lee, I think this is a little bit more. This is great. We're going to go into the last topic because
It's
we're
kind of a
rolling
blame
right into
game, right?
challenges here. So I think we're just going to roll with it.
Wouldn't you
So,
call that like the blame game? If they're like saying the compliance team needs to do better, it's
well,
like you're
that's
sort of
true.
blaming.
But remember, but remember though, who usually runs most of these companies at the top? They
Yeah,
usually
product
come from
people, sales
engineering. They
people,
don't,
yeah,
or product.
engineering.
They don't come from
Yeah,
compliance and usually security. So as much as I would love to say it's all even, and you're right, it's all priority. We all have to do it. They all have to do it. That changing that behavior and culture is going to come down to what the business metric impact is of not doing the work, right? Business impact. The risk thing is important, but that's not going to move the needle as much as saying, hey, we're not going to be able to sell to this market, or we're going to lose the customer trust and lose to a competitor because they can credibly put out these certifications on time. So I do agree with you that we have to change that behavior and culture. But I think where a lot of people are struggling, this on the compliance side, is how do you have that story with these people that have been ingrained in this mindset that compliance, I'll even say security to some degree, is an overhead function that doesn't add that kind of business value. So I spend the least amount that I can, whereas what I can tell you is through the work we've done, engineering teams now start realizing through the education, through the delivery that, oh yeah, I do need to cut time out for this, because the compliance team now can show me, at least for our team, we can show them that we're efficiently doing it, that we're not wasting time. So that actually allows them more time to do other things if they spend more effort making our lives easier on the compliance side. So I would say is that it worked out really well, in some aspects, but it is this cultural mindset that has to change at a senior level to say that there is a cost to do this business and it has to be accounted for and tracked and reported on at the same level as the other engineering work if we're truly going to be successful moving forward.
yeah. Fantastic points. I would say one thing I would add there is I also think it's a fallacy, right, to go through and say, oh, security is just an overhead, or compliance is just an overhead, or pick your organization that's typically internal. They're just an overhead. They don't add any value, and that's not true, right? I think that let's take security as an example, right? In other roles or current roles that I've worked in, right, there is a external customer facing, right, type of interaction, right? You get questionnaires, you talk to customers about your features, you're helping to indirectly, right, sell the things that the company does by having that security expertise. Now, look, we're not getting sales commission, right? We're not the ones actually getting compensated for that, but you can go through as an organization and you can say, okay, I helped with this deal and this deal and this deal. I talked to these customers and they're this amount of money. And at the end of the year, you can be like, great, my security team helped with, pick a number, $10 million of indirect revenue, right, by interacting with customers in some other way, right? So I think that that's a very dangerous mindset for people to be in, is that, oh, this is just an overhead. This is just an overhead, right?
Yeah.
Same with compliance, right? Is that if you don't do certain compliance activities in those industries at which you operate, you will not be able to sell in those
Yeah.
industries. Like case in point, right? So it's like you can go back and say, great, show me all of the sales that we've had in finance. Okay, if we didn't do SOC and PCI and whatever, we would not be able to complete those deals. Therefore, indirectly, right, this team compliance contributed to whatever number. And then to your point, you can go back and say, look, when I inherited this program or when I started this program, we were at, I don't know, it was taking 3 weeks, right, to get all of our, stuff in a row, and then another 6 months to complete each activity. We've necked that down to a quarter, right? We've halved the time. Wow, that's actually like a lot of engineering time we've given back to them to make it more efficient by having that credibility, by listening to our stakeholders and what the pain points are, and then making a well-rounded, well-honed, functioning organization. So like, I think there's a lot to unpack there, but like, I kind of bristle a little bit when people are like, oh, security is just an overhead. And it's like, come on,
Well,
like
I'm not saying that's my
I'm
position
not, I'm
clearly
not
because
bristling
I
at
do.
you. I'm saying this is a
No,
common industry thing that I see where it's
it
like
is a
security is an
common
overhead.
industry thing,
Yeah.
right? Like it is common. So I think what we're really talking about and that we're vehemently agreeing on is that is really about how do we go about changing that mindset in a constructive way that integrates it more closely with a lot of the the engineering practices and costs that are happening. And I think in some cases it's easy, but I'll tell you that one example you used about okay, you've helped answer questions as part of deals. That's a hard metric to capture about the ROI of that, right? So I know, like, even in my own team, we talk about, okay, but like you say, we're not outselling, and there's lots of things that go into a sales deal.
Yeah.
So can
So
you actually
I'll
account
give one
for the
example.
time you spend doing that as that value? And I think that's still something that we're all struggling with today.
Yeah, and look, totally fair, right? And this all depends on the underlying, I'd say, operational efficiency of your organization. The way that I've solved this in the past was that we had Salesforce, right? And in Salesforce, for example, anytime that the sales team needed help from the security team, they would tag it as like a specific
Hmm.
tag. They would say like, hashtag security or whatever they wanted to. And then at the end of the year, you could go through and like
Right.
pull all of the things tagged in 2023 with hashtag security, and it'd be like, oh, that was this much, right? And so sure, it's not perfect. If you wanted to get down to it, you could like capitalize resources. No one wants to do that, right? I do think though, like this again comes back to that culture perception change, which is like, look, we're here to try to help you add value, right? And like we're going to try and be as efficient with that as possible, but we still need you to do something. Please help us do that thing. I think we're in violent agreement here. I'd actually like to
Yeah, we
answer a
are.
question in the chat that I saw from Eugene, and he says, I would say that unified metrics here is time. In other words, the senior leadership team need to answer the question, how many times per quarter, year, percentage is devoted to security and compliance activities? And here's what I'm going to say to this. I think this is a very great thought process to go down. In practicality, it is exceptionally dangerous. And let me tell you why. Okay. And so I do think it's a good metric to measure and say, like, after the fact, how much time did the team spend on compliance or security or whatever, right? That's a great metric. Where this is dangerous is if you go to those engineering teams and say, you have to spend 20% of your time on this. What I found that ends up happening is the teams will use any sort of thing related or whatever they think is that thing, and they'll lump it into that 20% bucket, and they'll be like, well, I spent 20% on compliance. And you'll be like, yeah, but you didn't give me the evidence I needed to complete that report. Yeah, but I spent 20%, so I'm good. I'm going to move on. And so this is where it gets dangerous, is that you set like this hard limit of like 20%, and they just fill the bucket with whatever they think meets that, and you don't get the outcome that you wanted to. So I think it's a good idea to retroactively, after the fact, go back and
Yeah.
say, well, how much time are people spending? But
Right.
I don't think it's a good idea up front to say you have to spend this amount of time, right?
No,
Because
I
then
actually,
people fill the bucket
yeah, no,
longer.
I totally agree with that. I mean, I'll tell you, the way we're using time is exactly the way that you said we should be using it, which is how much time did it take you to perform a function? And then
Yeah,
you could go look to optimize the time you spent doing a required function to minimize it, right? Like I don't I
right.
also agree that there shouldn't be a set time for activities. It should be needs based, but you have to be able to account for the time you do because in the end we're all billed by hours, whether you're salary or non-salary.
Sure.
And so we have to show, what is our operational costs. So time is a great factor to use, but I do agree with you that you really don't want to set like a hard limit of time, but you do want to measure the time and then you want to trend it over time. Because if you
Correct.
realize you are spending 20% of your time doing the actual functions, well, there would be a lot of room for efficiency to go garner. But again, you're looking at recording what you're spending. Like we found, I'm telling you, we found by tracking time with the metric that I talked about in the last session, is that we reduced 20,000 hours of engineering unplanned work through auditing by looking at how long it was taking by a time metric and then shrinking that down through optimization, right? That's what it was taking, not what we said you should be taking. And then we got it down to something minimal. So I think that the time is a great factor, but again, it's how you use the time. Because again, engineers track time, they track sprints. So that's one of those metrics that I talk about that says it really does align with engineering, but compliance traditionally does not measure that metric, right?
Right.
There's been no capacity to measure that. So I think that it's a great discussion point on how to align those metrics to something engineers care about, and then also then show them where they can gain efficiencies by reducing the time it takes to actually go do that work. So again, great comment, Eugene. Thanks for bringing it up. So Lee,
Yep.
let's continue on. And what are some of the other challenges other than this one that you expect when building or maturing a program from a security perspective?
Yeah, we've kind of touched on them, a little bit, but I'll just kind of summarize. I think what we had in the blog post, which is there's three main challenges that I see, organizations run into, right? And the first one is expectation misalignment, and we kind of talked about that a little bit. Is that you've come in an inherited program, or there's people that think security are just going to tell them no all the time, or maybe it's an impossible problem. They're like, you're going to go get this, FedRAMP within 6 months. And you're like, yeah, just kidding. Right. So I think that's the first thing, which is like expectation misalignment, is that they either have an impossible task of like, oh, we had a breach and now we're, required by the, FTC to, have a security function. You're going to go fix all these things for us in a year. And you're like, there's no way, right? And so that's I think the first issue. The second issue is cultural, which we talked about, which is great. Maybe everyone agrees that security and compliance are important. So the expectations are there. Yes, you can take, 18 months to get this program up and running, whatever it is, fine. But then culturally, they're like, they're not doing the work, right? They're not prioritizing the things. They haven't shifted their behavior. They're ignoring the asks that you have and just kind of slamming out, features or whatever it is that you're having an issue with. That's a cultural behavioral change, right? That requires, again, those top senior leadership to come down and be like, nope, that's your thing. You built it. And like, Lee didn't write that code. Like, why aren't you fixing that? That type of thing. And so I think that's the second one. So you have expectation misalignment, you have cultural misalignment, and then the third one that I wrote about is budgetary misalignment, right? So you can have the expectations are there. Yep, we'll give you, 18 months to 2 years to fix this thing. Culturally, yep, we're going to do that. We're going to prioritize the work. Sorry, we're not going to fund you, right? So you don't get any resources, or no, you can't buy that tool, or, whatever it's going to be, right? And so you're kind of like dead in the water, right? You're ready to go. The starting gun has gone off and you're like, I forgot my shoes, right? And so I think, those are all things that I would say hopefully have come out in the interview, right? But obviously until you've hit the ground and actually inherited or started building the program and you've made your first budget ask, or you've talked to your first, peer or whatever it's going to be, you've made your first ask to the engineering team, hey, go do this thing. And then, right, 6 weeks later, they still haven't done that thing. Now, you're in a bit of an issue and you need to kind of go sort out what's the root cause of that problem. So, those are the biggest ones that I found where, great, one or more of these things will really, really, really derail, right, your program from getting off of the ground, just because, you kind of can't overcome those without getting the support of your rest of your executive staff.
Yeah, I totally agree with those. I mean, we've been touching upon them, but I think the biggest ones for me are just a couple of areas which kind of build on yours. Like the first one is really about changing the culture, like you say. Like we have to be seen as organizations that are adding direct value, and it may be difficult, but making money, I somewhat agree with you. I don't really get the same, like we got to do a new framework. It's like a feature, right? So at some point you have to go do it if you're going to sell into that business. You get some credit for that. That's true. But I think I know we've had a lot of success is we can show that we're saving money, not necessarily making it directly, but by having an efficient program, meaning that like when we collect evidence, the first time resolution, we're not going back multiple times, we're on schedule. They've got good instruction asks, so they can execute easily, maybe even automate it. I think that's one area where you can show and build trust at saying if the engineering teams believe that you are running your program truly efficiently, like you're not going back and it's not painful, there's no friction. Hey, they know they have to collect the evidence once because that's how you get through an audit. You have to collect at least one piece of evidence per control. But if you're doing that in such an efficient manner that you can show, it builds a lot of trust and they will actually then encourage more work in that space. So I think that's really important. That's about aligning the metrics. I think the next one that I look at is that requires the compliance area to think of itself like a true business, right? I talk about the days of the blank checkbook and the bat are kind of gone. It doesn't scale. So if you have that as a principle, meaning that we now have to account for the hours that we're asking, the money we're asking teams to go spend, right? Because every time that we're asking them to go do work, we're taking money from their pockets. They know they have to do it. No senior leader I've ever talked to has said compliance isn't important, but they believe it's very inefficient. Because if you think about the practices, they haven't really changed much in the last, 20 plus years I've been dealing with it. We're still kind of using the same on-prem type model where you kind of roll in, gather a bunch of stuff painfully once, and then roll out for another year. Well, you have to move to continuous compliance. And that model doesn't work. I even talked about how SOC audits, the auditors are enforcing that old model by making you do 4 a year. I think we talked about it briefly last time. That is a shim for a much bigger issue, which is that we can't trust the drift in between. So we have to change our practice on that. And I do think that that's one of the areas that's challenging for every team is to figure out how to change your compliance program to really meet the rate of change of engineering now, which is really different. So I think thinking of it as a business, which then has you think about the metrics and the dollars and what you're asking for other teams, I think it's really impactful from a program perspective for the senior leaders. So you can show that you are spending, the right amount, not saying the least amount, but the right amount on the engineering and the compliance program, because you can track the time more explicitly. And I think the last thing that I would really kind of say is that, as the world continues to change, I think the compliance teams have to change how they think about the program, meaning our job is really more about translation of these requirements to a good engineering ask and not necessarily just shoving requirements and asks over the door. If you don't understand how the engineers actually assimilate data and how they have to go do the work, it makes it really hard to give them an efficient ask. So you have to do some education. You have to kind of learn the other side of the house. And that will help you build a much better, not only trust relationship, but it'll also help you build better requirements because engineers hate ambiguous specs, right? And a bad ask of any compliance amount of work is really a bad spec at the end of the day. And they don't know how to execute it. Again, it's very ambiguous, likely going to have bugs in it. So I think those are the biggest areas that I would probably think about that we're all still struggling with as we continue to evolve these programs.
Yeah, that's great. Let me let me add a little bit there. So I 100% agree with you that moving to some sort of automation, right, or continuous compliance is, not just a compliance, improvement, but also a security improvement, right? Because we want to know the drift as well. We want to know, hey, you deployed this thing. Is it still in the same state that when we thought it was, or has it drifted and now has new vulnerabilities or whatever it's going to be, right? So I do think that the industry hasn't quite caught up there yet, right? In terms of there's still some old practices, right? The auditors come in and they ask you off of a set questionnaire as opposed to you being like, hey, look at this dashboard. We already answered your questions. Let us know if you need anything, right? Similarly, the customer questionnaires are basically a proxy, right, for them trying to answer their compliance requirements by asking their customers or partners questions, right? And it's like, well, okay, how do we handle that one? And I do think this is probably a topic for another day, but again, if you, instead of asking a spreadsheet, right, or filling in a form, right, if you had a way to just go and say, hit this API, suck out all of this data, and we show you all of our compliance metrics or whatever it is, great. If there's a way to do that securely where you're not revealing vulnerabilities, that may be an interesting topic to explore as well. The other one I want to talk about is in security, there's similar metrics, right? So for you, it might be time to resolution, or how long did it take to gather this evidence? Security has the same thing, right? So it's like how long was this thing vulnerable to when we detected it, right? So can we get that to be smaller, which means we're getting better detections and better responses? And then how long from when we detected it, to did we resolve it, right? And so we were vulnerable for less amount of time. Right. And so, those are some pretty classic incident response metrics, but I like to have a lot of my metrics be based on risk, right? So it's like, did the thing that we are the things that we did this year actually measurably reducing the risk to the business? Because that's the goal here, right? And if you come back and you start to seeing an upwards trend or something's going the wrong way, people aren't fixing vulnerabilities, for example. Let's say that the average time of vulnerability is, lingering or loitering is, let's say 180 days. Okay, can we get that down to 30 days? Wow, now we're not vulnerable for a long period of time, right? So I think there's a lot of metrics you can play with here, to your point. And, really, I think where this space is going is moving away from the manual, whether they're questionnaires, whether they're reports, whether they're snapshots in time, right? They're now moving to real-time information, get that stuff out there, make the decisions and pivot much faster. Because to your point, you don't want to go back to your senior leadership and be like, well, it took us, a quarter to just identify those things. It's like, really? Like, we're an engineering company. Why can't we figure that out, And so moving to those more automated or continuous processes, I think, is absolutely where everything is going.
Yeah, no, I absolutely agree. Again, this is a great topic to talk about, just not only some of the risks and challenges of building out or inheriting a compliance organization, but it's all part of a much larger discussion, which is how do we change the business, right? And so we talked a lot about metrics, a lot about mindsets, which I actually go through in detail in episodes 2 and 3 for those that are interested. But it really is, we have to change how the industry works to some degree, because the tools and processes that we talked about, they were really meant for a different structure and mode of engineering. And so I think this is a great way to start talking about what are some of those things that have to change if we're really going to not only pull the business along with us, meaning the engineering teams and the control owners, but also just how do we become more effective in getting more frameworks out faster. I mean, I've tripled the amount of frameworks in 5 years that we have to go audit against. And if you don't do that efficiently, there's no way the leaders are going to keep throwing money at that. So again, with that, Lee, I think we'll go ahead and call this one kind of done. Any final words before we take off?
Yeah, I mean, hopefully my internet stays up next time. But no, I think great conversation. Look, the reality is, as a security or compliance organization, is you are an agent of cultural change, right? And so remember, you're not as much changing technologies as you are changing behaviors, and that's going to make you much more successful going forward.
That's right. And with that, I'm going to call it. I'd like to thank the audience and those that had questions and comments. It's always great to interact and hear other people's thoughts. So again, I encourage everyone to go check out the blog down below. And with that, we'll call this a day. I hope everyone has a great compliance and security day. Have a great one, everyone. Thanks again, Lee.
See ya.